name's Paul, and I've got Beth down the end here, and we're really thrilled that we've got two great speakers that are experts in this area that can provide us with a hell of a lot more information to support what you've just seen here today. So I'd like you to welcome Brian Paddick, who is a politician and former Deputy Assistant Commissioner of the Met Police, and Stephen Morris, who's Chemsex and Sexual Crime Lead at Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service. So welcome to you both. So we've got a series of questions, but if you've got some questions, please feel free to ask the chaps while we have them in our disposal. So I'll get started, and this is a question for both of you, both coming from kind of crime and legal backgrounds. So drugs have always appeared, or they've been prevalent in the gay community. How has that changed in recent years?
The nature of the drugs, I think, at the moment is something that we've never seen before. Yeah, and you're right. The likes of coke, LSD, MDMA have been around some time, and yes, some people would round up in casualty if they've overdone it a bit, but that wasn't to the level we are seeing now. And people may not know, but at one stage in the Vauxhall area, with the centre of the nighttime economy for a section of the gay scene, admissions to St Thomas's got so bad every weekend from those venues that the venues landed up paying a levy to St Thomas's. That was the extent. So the physical impact of these drugs alone, and then in more recent times, I guess we've also got a cohort of men who have been using these substances for quite some time, and whereas occasionally people would experience a paranoia or a psychosis and come out of it, for people that have been using for a long time, they're going into it and not coming out of it, and of course the knock-on effect on all areas of life is then more than evident. I think in relation to crystal meth alone, in this country we are still at seeing the tip of the iceberg and finding out about it. So I would say in summary, the power of these substances is something to behold, and the way that it's able to distort people's thinking and behaviour is very, very different. Crystal meth in particular propels people into action, where if we were shooting up heroin, we'd all be zonked out of it. That's the difference.
And Brian, from a policing perspective, from your experience, and even though that was some time ago.
I mean, I think the play captures how dangerous GBL or GBH, or G as it's known, is, in that a few drops or a few milliliters, and it can give you a sense of euphoria, and it's an aphrodisiac. A little bit more, it's used as a date rape drug because people move in and out of consciousness. And then if you take too much, then the respiratory system shuts down. So an ex of mine who became my best friend took a dose of G before he went to a sex party, forgot, took some more G when he was at the sex party, was allowed to fall asleep, was left on his own. When the ambulance came, he'd probably been not breathing for about half an hour, and was brain dead. So, and it's the fact that people don't realise how dangerous the drug is. You had a phase where nightclubs, concerned the police were going to shut them down if people kept collapsing on the dance floor, were dragging people outside rather than getting immediate medical help. And this problem of people not seeking medical attention because what they've taken is illegal can be fatal when it comes to stuff like G.
At that point, that was happening in the venues with people being dragged outside. And of course, if they were dragged outside, yes, that was one scenario. In many of the venues, there was also instant first aid, etc. But of course, the whole thing has moved away, on the whole, from the club scene and is now happening in private homes, where that help is not available. And of course, people's reluctance, if someone does go unconscious, to call the police because the implications for them dictates the behaviour. So people end up in very, very vulnerable situations. And I guess the only people that really know the accurate figures around deaths at the moment would be the coroner's court,
You say that, and it's going to be the subject of a Channel 4 dispatches that I've been involved with, but post-mortems do not routinely check for G, and therefore we do not know how many young people in particular are dying from a G because some otherwise unexplained deaths. They don't run the toxicology tests. G, I think, doesn't stay in the bloodstream for that long. And therefore, we don't know. What we're likely to be seeing is the tip of the iceberg.
What do you think, on that note, what do you think can be done to raise awareness of the dangers and kind of taking, if it's going to be taking it in a safer capacity?
It's a real problem because from my own personal experience, families whose loved ones die tragically and unexpectedly either want to blame somebody else for what happened rather than it being an overdose, or they certainly don't want to admit that their loved one died from a drugs overdose. And therefore, it took me 5 years to start talking about my ex. The family still think that he was poisoned. And therefore, people, there isn't enough people talking about the issue. When tragic deaths happen, they tend to be covered up, not necessarily in a way that the play suggests, or that the real case that the play is based on, where the police assume it's an overdose rather than it being a murder. As I say, the whole thing, people not talking about it, not wanting to admit it, not being tested at post-mortem, means that there is not enough public awareness of what's going on.
And I think even the context isn't talked about. If we think that the context being shame and vulnerability, that doesn't get spoken about. Those are very uncomfortable aspects of life for all of us, I guess, but the men involved often come into it as a self-medicating process because of shame and experiences of vulnerability, and then sort of repeat that whole pattern in being shamed and vulnerable about the very thing they're using to address the pain and the issue. Immense shame and vulnerability that we don't talk about, and I think that's to do, yes, with gay culture, but also of male culture as well.
And in terms of how can you use this safely? I mean, it's a colourless, odourless liquid. You know what the concentration is. You can very easily, when you're not completely with it, accidentally pick up somebody else's drink, which is laced with G, particularly at these parties. Okay, you have either people with spreadsheets, or I think they're called G Bibles, where people write down what time they took a dose and what the next dose is okay until everybody in the room is not really in control. Maybe like when people go out drinking for the night, there's a designated driver who doesn't drink because they've got to drive the car home. Maybe there should be at these parties somebody who does not take the substance and looks after everybody else. Now, I've experienced parties where there is very much a culture of making sure people are okay, looking after each other and so forth. But you also hear of experiences where people, in exchange for the not having to pay for the drug, allow the people at the party to do basically whatever they want to that individual in exchange for the drugs. Then you are into criminal activity. Really serious, in terms of rape and so forth.
Okay. So just continuing on that point, with both of your backgrounds, so from a political and law enforcement services approach, what is the approach that is being taken towards chemsex at the moment?
I guess that I exist at all is a bit of an indicator, and not perhaps a very happy one. If I say a little bit how that has developed, I've worked in sexual crime for almost 30 years, and for the last 2 years it's been chemsex. Initially we thought it was just sexual crime, but now my title's slightly shifted, so it's lead for chemsex and crime, because they're a mixture, and it's roughly half and half that we're seeing with convicted men. of non-sexual crimes and sexual crimes. Obviously, as practitioners, at all stages of the criminal justice process, from investigating police officers, the courts, and right through to someone's end sentence, including prisons and community staff, there needs to be an awareness. We cannot even start to recognise this issue and work with it effectively if we're not recognising it and understanding the context of it. So a large part of my work has initially been about case identification. Yes, sometimes it does get picked up and recognised at arrest and investigation stage, but if you've been arrested on a serious charge and the chem element has been hidden, and it can be very well hidden, you're not going to then volunteer that information. But of course later in your sentence, or to get the courts sentencing appropriately with the right interventions to support someone through the vulnerabilities that were the causal factors, and wanting not to return to it and then reoffend later, we're going to need to know that. Now, if someone's in a good relationship with their prison officer or probation officer, that may come out and support can be given. But if we can know about it in the very early stages, so one of the initial things I did was to devise a court assessment tool to help court staff understand it. You noticed in the play the very particular language that has developed around this behaviour. So we need to know that language, and we need to feel comfortable knowing it, because then people will feel more trusting, more open about what they've been doing, and we can then respond more appropriately. Our existing programmes of treatment, both in prison and in the probation service, were not adequate. It wouldn't touch the sides really and address some of the vulnerabilities in the context of people's lives, which can be very, very extreme in relation to this particular behaviour. So the other thing I did was to develop a treatment intervention programme that can be delivered on a one-to-one basis by probation officers and prison officers to address again the factors, so someone can be in a much more resilient and stronger position. But that is just the start, really. The one thing I was hearing from my officers was that they felt overwhelmed by the material. They didn't understand the parts of the community that was involved. They didn't know the language, and that makes it very difficult to work with. So again, part of the resource that I've developed was a London-wide monthly peer support group for the professionals. So criminal justice staff meeting with sexual health staff, where they are very familiar with this territory, and that has really helped officers grow in their confidence, and to involve that the police were having a similar process, and also the sharing of intelligence, so we can be upfront with trying to prevent this situation from getting worse, but it isn't getting any better. So we've still got a lot of work to do.
Okay. And Brian, from a political...
I mean, it's a very difficult one to handle. I mean, the play, I understand, is based on the Stephen Port case, where a number of young gay men were found in a graveyard in East London, and it was quite a while before the police realised a serial killer was at work, rather than there being overdoses because of assumptions that were made. There has been a report, an investigation into the way the police handled that, and the publication of that report keeps being put back and put back and put back for some reason. So I'm guessing it's not doesn't make very good reading. But you know, politically, you know, I'm pro legalisation and regulation of drugs. That harm reduction should be what this should be all about. The difficulty is when you get to things like GHB, GBL, how can it be used safely is the question, particularly in those sorts of parties where everybody gets off their head and nobody is in control. So it is a very difficult situation, and regrettably, from a political point of view, you may have noticed that politicians are somewhat distracted by other issues. And the last thing, to be honest, that the police want, if the police can explain a death away rather than having a very labour-intensive investigation into a death, And politicians, if an issue is not on the public radar as an issue, particularly if it only affects one particular or mainly affects one minority group within the overall population, then politicians are reluctant to take on yet another very difficult issue that they may not have or that there are no easy answers to. So, we have got to, and this play is one way of doing it, but we have got to start talking about these very serious issues and the issues that the men have who feel that they can't engage in sex, like the character in the play, without taking these substances, and what those psychological problems are, the support that those individuals need so that they can engage in sexual activity without the need to take what can be very dangerous drugs.
And I think that last point that Brian made is what we hear from the men a lot. If you've had sex for sometimes many years now, up there, to come back down and have just sober sex, almost impossible. People assume that the addiction is to the substances, and yes, certainly for some people that would be true, but I think there's a greater addiction to the social connection that this involves. That's often the driving factor of why people come into these situations. The assumption is that the gay scene is all pink and fluffy, and yes, I think on one day of the year when it's Pride it may look like that, but there's a very different side to the gay scene, and my friend Serena here refers to it as the dark side of the rainbow. That's what we need to talk about. The gay scene can be a very hostile place. The mental health rates of gay men indicate that. The suicide rate and the self-harm rate is through the roof compared to the heterosexual population. It's not a rosy picture despite our various liberations. It's great if you fit in, but of course many people don't fit in. And to find a group of people where you feel comfortable, where your self-esteem is fed and nurtured, and yes, on crystal meth you feel absolutely great and think you are great, then that is a very comforting experience, and people go back to that again and again and again because they feel connected. Take that away, and we see this with guys being released from prison, and when they're on licence in the community, they are straight back into it. And I don't think it's necessarily the chems that are driving that. I think they are straight back into a community of connection that they know, but it seldom ends well.
And whilst it may have been, when I was born, it was illegal, and when I was in my 20s, I felt the only way I could have a relationship was to marry a woman, which I did. I was married for 5 years before I had the courage to be able to come out about it. And I think we've gone from the primary issue being men being ashamed of being gay because of society's views and religious views and so forth. Now, another big issue is the way that gay people treat each other. The sort of body fascism, the racism, those sorts of issues within the gay community. Get yourself a profile, albeit a false one, and go on Grindr, and you will soon find how nasty the gay community is to itself, let alone how the bigots and the people who are prejudiced against gay people behave.
Okay, now while we've got the experts here, have we got any questions from the audience? Yeah.
All right, thanks very much. I just wondered what's your view on, in terms of kind of creators and creative artists working in different disciplines, what is it that you would want them to be doing in terms of messaging, or in terms of forwarding a positive agenda?
I think this play is an example because it gives us permission to think and talk about things that we would rather perhaps push away and that we find uncomfortable. So it certainly has a role in that, and the awareness that Brian was speaking about that is very much needed. I also think from my client group, so I'm talking about people who have committed serious crimes, who are regarded as high risk of offending and high risk of harm, they need a community as well, particularly at the point where they come out of prison. They've often lost everything, including their family and friends. And it's incredibly difficult to find services and projects that will accept those men. Now, I know the probation service in London can help that process and work with agencies and create partnerships, particularly creative partnerships and creative work to help those men. But we need much more. It's just not there at the moment.
I think maybe in addition to plays like this that enable us to talk about issues that people otherwise might be uncomfortable with, is to have positive gay stories about people loving each other for who they are, rather than objectifying people who look young and beautiful, or whatever whatever it is that particularly turns you on, to emphasise that there are many gay relationships based on emotion and personality, and the feeling that you have for somebody beyond the way that they look.
Yes. Apart from 56 Dean Street, where does somebody who wishes to exit from chemsex go? I'm a volunteer receptionist just down the road at DS at Dean Street Express, so I'm not a medic, but I do see the casualties sometimes coming in. I don't always know that they are, but I know what a fabulous job Dean Street does, and particularly David Stewart and his team. But they seem to fall between two stools. They don't, because they do such a wonderful job, but Public Health England is under savage cuts. We see sexual health clinics, the budget's been slashed because they're in the care of local authorities. So do you want to keep a library, or do you want to keep a sexual health clinic? So I just wonder where people go, other than to the wonderful clinics in this very street. And if you live in the provinces, I think God help you.
I said to somebody earlier it was nice to come to Dean Street and not be going to the clinic, but it was a bit of a unique experience for me. No, I mean, you're absolutely right. And going back to what I was saying before about this being a hidden problem, in that that it's not a routine test done in a post-mortem to see whether somebody has got GBH or GBL in their bloodstream. And unless and until it is recognised in society as a major problem, then you're not going to get adequate funding for the particular issue of chemsex. I mean, as you say, sexual health services are under considerable pressure simply because of the reduction in central government funding to local authorities, who are now responsible for sexual health clinics. But the particular issue of chemsex and the particular specialised services that 56 Dean Street in particular provides, are a subset of that. And the more we talk about the issue, the more people realise what a problem it is, the more likely we are to get adequate funding to have more centres set up in addition to 56 Dean Street.
And certainly all the sexual health clinics in London, not just Dean Street, will work with this area, so it isn't just reliant on Dean Street. We're also fortunate in London to have the only specialist LGBT dedicated drug agency, which is Antidote, run by London Friend, and Spectra, a much smaller organisation, has just set up a mindfulness process. I think there is need for caution, because the assumption certainly of many professionals is that, I must get my chemsex client into therapy, and often someone isn't ready and may not be ready for that for a long, long time. But to have social connection is absolutely crucial. So networks that enable people to connect with each other outside of that chemsex setting can be a saving grace for someone, and certainly get them thinking about the wider aspects of life. I can't say too strongly how once someone is involved in this, and particularly if it's becoming a very regular habit. For some people it's every day, then the rest of life starts to close down. And once someone is in that situation, that's where the potential for crime starts to occur.
Impromptuly, I might just call upon Matt Steinberg, who's the artistic director of Outside Edge Theatre Company, one of the producers of this production, who has been established for 20 years and working in the area of addiction. And Matt, you might just want to explain what Outside Edge does.
So Outside Edge, in addition to creating theatre productions which are about issues related to substance misuse, we also run free weekly drama workshops for people who are affected by substance misuse as well. So we have many men who come to us who have been affected by chemsex, coming to us through Dean Street or the Club Drug Clinic, which is another great resource in London, specifically for drugs related to the chemsex scene or the club scene. And it's what I always sort of joke with funders is that it turns out that gay men, whether they're in recovery or not, really love theatre. So we do provide, sort of accidentally, I suppose, that kind of connection to that kind of environment for many men in London and hopefully around the country eventually if we keep getting funding. So if anyone wants to fund us to do that kind of work, woo! But yeah, it is. I mean, for people trying to support their recovery maintenance or their harm reduction, having a supportive peer environment in which everyone is going through the same thing and a consistent network of people supporting them is really important. And whether it's through drama, knitting, or a running club, it doesn't really matter. I think that's a really essential aspect of everyone's well-being when they're coming out of substance use.
Again, I think people assume that the already established drug agencies across London can respond to this. And even though we're quite a way into this chemsex issue, 8-9 years, the generic substance misuse clinics have still not got a satisfactory response. And certainly I've witnessed clients going and coming back, so I cannot go back there, they just don't get it now. And because it is such a different culture. And I've been to Public Health England Roundtable on sex, etc., and I hear the commissioners scratching their heads and saying, we don't understand why gay men won't come to our needle exchanges. Well, when the men involved won't even say they have a drug problem and they don't inject, they slam, they're hardly likely going to turn up at an NHS needle exchange. That will not happen.
Okay. Do we have a final question? Yes.
Hi,
there's one up there.
Sorry. I work with vulnerable young people who identify as LGBT and are trying to get into sexual relationships. They generally have learning disabilities, and one of the things I do is try and support them to access that. And one of the main concerns I generally have is that they'll end up in this type of situation with their additional vulnerabilities. Is there anything that I could do to support people to access the type of relationships that they want to access without ending up in this type of situation?
I guess what became very clear to us in criminal justice very early on, and this initially was the first cohort we thought we were working with, where we thought the men becoming convicted were really naive and didn't have criminal intent as we would see with more familiar clients, and there would be no previous, there'd be absence of grooming, it would seem to be very situational. And I think for a lot of men that is perhaps true. I mean, yes, they've gone on and they've commissioned a serious offence and they need to face the consequences of that. But not understanding about consent, not knowing what constitutes a sexual offence in particular, and not knowing what the consequences are was a deficit in all those men's thinking. And some of those men were intelligent with careers, but this was territory they did not know about. We also now know there is another whole group, and this would apply very much to the young men you're working with and their vulnerability, is that we now know there is an organised element to some of the crimes taking place. Even if it's not organised, there are men who are seeking out this context in order to commission their offences, because they know there is a vulnerable population that are very unlikely to report the issue to the police. And I think Gallup, who's the agency in London that work with victims, say that 90% of the men they work with that report being a victim in a chemsex context will not go to the police. You know, these are alarming situations that we're not facilitating appropriate action when people have willingly committed and gone out of their way. And what we're seeing is a very extreme type of offending in these situations, and not just sexual. So I think basic awareness, to come back to your crucial question, very basic awareness of consent and how to look after yourself, and in the context of self-esteem, because people won't look after themselves if they feel shit about themselves, actually, at the end of the day. So anything that can address those really basic things can be a great protective factor for when someone finds themselves in the middle of a chemsex situation, because they will, or people will find them and take them. That certainly happens.
All right, we need to wrap it up because we do have another performance tonight. So I'd really like you all to thank Brian and Stephen for being here.